When James II was driven from his throne, he fled to France. His quarrel with King William was taken up by Louis XIV, and in 1689 war began between France and England. The strife thus started in the Old World soon spread to the New, and during 8 years the frontier of New England and New York was the scene of French and Indian raids, massacres, and burning towns. The frontier of English settlement consisted of a string of little towns close to the coast in Maine and New Hampshire, and some 60 miles back from the coast in Massachusetts. Of a second string of towns up the Connecticut Valley to central Massachusetts, and of a third up the Hudson to the Mohawk and up the Mohawk to Schenectady. Most of Maine and New Hampshire, all of what is now Vermont, and all New York north and west of the Mohawk was a wilderness pierced by streams which afforded the French and Indians easy ways of reaching the English frontier. The French frontier consisted of a few fishing towns scattered along the shores of Acadia, what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and eastern Maine, and a few settlements along the St. Lawrence to Fort Frontenac, just where the river leaves Lake Ontario. Between these frontiers in Maine and New Hampshire were the Abenaki Indians, close allies of the French and bitter enemies of the English. And in New York the Iroquois, allies of the English and enemies of the French since the day in 1609 when Champlain defeated them. The governor of New France was Count Frontenac, a man of action, keen, fiery, and daring, a splendid executive, an able commander, and well called the father of New France. Gathering his Frenchmen and Indians as quickly as possible, Frontenac formed 3 war parties on the St. Lawrence in the winter of 1689-90, that at Montreal was to march against Albany, that at Three Rivers was to ravage the frontier of New Hampshire, and that at Quebec the frontier of Maine. The Montreal party was ready first and made its way on snowshoes to the little palisaded village of Schenectady, passed through the open gates in a blinding storm of snow, and in the darkness of night massacred 80 men, women, and children, took captive as many more, and left the place in ashes. The second war party of French and Indians left the St. Lawrence in January 1690, spent 3 months struggling through the wilderness, and in March fell upon the village of Salmon Falls, laid it in ashes, ravaged the farms nearby, massacred some 30 men, women, and children, and carried off some 50 prisoners. This deed done, the party hurried eastward and fell in with the third party, from Quebec. The two then attacked and captured Fort Loyal, where Portland now stands, and massacred or captured most of the inhabitants. Smarting under the attacks of the French and Indians, New England struck back. Its fleet, with a few hundred militia under William Phips, captured and pillaged Port Royal, and for a time held Acadia. A little army of troops from Connecticut and New York marched against Montreal, and a fleet and army under Phips sailed for Quebec. But the one went no farther than Lake Champlain, and Phips, after failing in an attack on Quebec, returned to Boston. For 7 years more the French and Indians ravaged the frontier before the Treaty of Ryswick put an end to the war in 1697. In the short interval of peace which followed, the French made a settlement at Biloxi, as we have seen, and founded Detroit, 1701. In Europe the French king, Louis XIV, placed his grandson on the throne of Spain and, on the death of James II, recognized James's young son as King James III of England. For this, war was declared by England in 1701. The struggle which followed was known abroad as the War of the Spanish Succession, but in our country as Queen Anne's War. Again the frontier from Maine to Massachusetts was the scene of Indian raids and massacres. Haverhill was laid waste a second time, and Deerfield in the Connecticut Valley was burned. The attack on Deerfield was a typical Indian raid. The village, consisting of 41 houses strung along a road, stood on the extreme northwestern frontier of Massachusetts. In the center of the place was a square wooden meeting house which, with some of the houses, was surrounded by a stockade 8 feet high flanked on 2 corners by blockhouses. Late in February 1704, a band of French and Indians from Canada reached the town, hid in the woods 2 miles away, and just before dawn moved quietly across the frozen snow, rushed into the village, and, raising the war whoop, beat in the house doors with axe and hatchet. A few of the wretched inmates escaped half-clad to the next village, but 49 men, women, and children were massacred, and 100 more were led away captives. As the war went on, the English colonists twice attacked Port Royal in vain, but on the third attack in 1710 the place was captured. This time the English took permanent possession and renamed it Annapolis in honor of the Queen. To Acadia was given the name Nova Scotia. Encouraged by the success at Port Royal, the greatest fleet ever seen, up to that time, in American waters was sent against Quebec, and an army of 2,300 men marched by way of Lake Champlain to attack Montreal. But the fleet, having lost 9 ships and 1,000 men in the fog at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, returned to Boston, and the commander of the army, hearing of this, marched back to Albany. When peace was made by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, France was forced to give up to Great Britain Acadia, Newfoundland, and all claim to the territory drained by the rivers that flow into Hudson Bay. 31 years now passed before France and Great Britain were again at war, and in this period, France took armed possession of the Mississippi Valley, constructed a chain of forts from New Orleans to the Ohio, and built Forts Niagara and Crown Point. This meant that the French were determined to keep the British out of Louisiana and New France and confine them to the seacoast. But the French were also determined to regain Acadia, and on the island of Cape Breton they built Louisburg, the strongest fortress in America. Such was the state of affairs when in 1744 Great Britain and France again went to war. As George II was then King of Great Britain, the colonists called the strife King George's War. The French now rushed down on Nova Scotia and attacked Annapolis. It seemed as if the whole of Nova Scotia would be conquered, but instead the people of New England sent out a fleet and army and captured Louisburg. When peace was made, 1748, after 2 years more of fighting, Great Britain gave Louisburg back to France. The war ended and no territory lost. The French at once laid plans to shut the British out of the Ohio Valley, which France claimed because the Ohio River and its tributaries flowed into the Mississippi. In 1749, therefore, a party of Frenchmen under Celeron were sent to take formal possession of that region. Paddling up the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario, these men carried their canoes around Niagara Falls, coasted along Lake Erie to a place near Chautauqua Lake, and going overland to the lake went down its outlet to the Allegheny River. There the men were drawn up. The French king was proclaimed owner of all the region drained by the Ohio, and a lead plate was buried at the foot of a tree. The inscription on the plate declared that the Ohio and all the streams that entered it and the land on both sides of them belonged to France. The party then passed down the Allegheny to the Ohio, and down the Ohio to the Miami, burying plates from time to time. Formal possession having been taken, the next step of the French was to build a log fort at Presque Isle, on Lake Erie where the city of Erie now is, and also forts Loup-Boeuf and Venango, on a branch of the Allegheny. But the English colonists likewise claimed the Mississippi Valley, by virtue of the old sea-to-sea grants, and the same year that Céloron came down the Allegheny, they also prepared to take possession of the Ohio Valley in a much more serious way. The French were burying plates and about to build forts. The English were about to plant towns and make settlements. Already in Pennsylvania and Virginia population was pushing rapidly westward. Already English traders crossed the mountains and with their goods packed on horses followed the trails down the Ohio Valley, going from village to village of the Indians and exchanging their wares for furs. Convinced that the westward movement of trade and population was favorable for speculation in land, some prominent men in Virginia formed the Ohio Company, and obtained from the British king a grant of 500,000 acres in the Ohio Valley on condition that within 7 years 100 families should be settled on it and a fort built and garrisoned. When, therefore, Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia heard that the French were building forts on the Allegheny, he became greatly alarmed and sent a messenger to demand their withdrawal. But the envoy, becoming frightened, soon turned back. Clearly a man was wanted, and Dinwiddie selected George Washington, a young man of 21 and an officer in the Virginia militia. Washington was to find out the whereabouts of the French, proceed to the French post, deliver a letter to the officer in command, and demand an answer. He was also to find out how many forts the French had built, how far apart they were, how well garrisoned, and whether they were likely to be supported from Quebec. Having received these instructions, Washington made his way in the depth of winter to Fort Loup-Boeuf, delivered the governor's letter, and brought back the refusal of the French officer to withdraw. Dinwiddie now realized that the French held the Allegheny, and that if they were to be shut out of the Ohio Valley, something had to be done at once. He therefore sent a party of backwoodsmen to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh now is. While they were at work, the French came down the Allegheny, captured the half-built fort, and in place of it erected a larger one which they named Duquesne. Meantime, Washington had been sent with some soldiers to Will's Creek in western Maryland. When he heard of the capture of the fort, he started westward, cutting a road for wagons and cannon as he went, and camped for a time at Great Meadows, in southwestern Pennsylvania. There, one night, he received word from Half King, a friendly Indian encamped with his band 6 miles away, that a French force was hidden near at hand. Washington with some 40 men set off at once for the Indian camp and reached it at daylight. A plan of attack was agreed on, and the march begun. On Washington's approach, the French flew to arms, and a sharp fight ensued in which the French commander Jumonville and 9 of his men were killed. At Great Meadows, Washington now threw up an entrenchment called Fort Necessity. Some more men having reached him, he left a few at the fort and went on westward again. But he had not gone far when word came that the French were coming to avenge the death of Jumonville. Washington therefore fell back to the fort, where he was attacked and on July 4, 1754, was forced to surrender, but was allowed to return to Virginia with his men. All previous wars between France and England had begun in the Old World, but now a great struggle had begun in the New.